A dog never looks at nothing for 10 minutes unless it has already seen the truth. That was the first thing Staff Sergeant Daniel Hayes thought as he stood near the edge of the training yard at Fort Belvoir that morning, watching the white German shepherd named Frost remain completely still in a way that didn't belong to any normal moment of routine. The base was already awake, engines warming up, boots striking pavement, radios murmuring fragments of daily operations, but none of it seemed to reach the dog. Frost stood facing a man who had just arrived with the morning supply convoy, a civilian contractor identified as Evan Cole, who moved with the calm precision of someone trying not to be remembered. Everything about Evan Cole looked ordinary on paper: clean credentials, verified clearance, and a face that never seemed to hold tension long enough to reveal intention. Yet Frost did not blink, did not shift, did not acknowledge anything else in the world except him. Daniel Hayes, a 34-year-old U.S. Marine with a composed posture and a reputation for reading situations before they escalated, noticed the subtle imbalance immediately, not in the man, but in the silence around the dog, because Frost was not behaving like a trained Unit K-9 responding to command. He was behaving like a presence locked onto a question only he could hear. The morning air carried a faint chill from the Potomac, cutting through the base in thin, invisible lines, and Evan Cole stopped near the logistics checkpoint, as if nothing in the world required explanation, adjusting a clipboard, glancing once at the yard, then away again, as though attention itself was something to be avoided. Frost took one step forward, then stopped again, maintaining distance that felt intentional, calculated, almost rehearsed, and Daniel felt that quiet discomfort in his chest that came when instinct spoke before evidence arrived. No alarms had been triggered, no reports filed, no breach detected, but the dog's attention had already rewritten the atmosphere of the place. Evan Cole's presence was temporary by design, a contractor rotation assigned to deliver equipment and verify inventory at 3 separate points across the base. Yet Frost tracked him not like a passerby, but like a variable that didn't belong in a controlled system. Daniel shifted his stance slightly, watching the exchange as the dog's head tilted a fraction, not aggressive, not relaxed, simply processing. Around them, the base continued its rhythm unaware, a truck reversing near the motor pool, distant voices calling out timing checks, the sound of metal doors opening and closing in steady cycles. But within a radius that seemed to belong only to Frost and the stranger, everything slowed. Evan Cole finally spoke to a passing officer, his voice even and polite, asking about unloading procedures, but Frost did not respond to sound, only to presence, and that distinction was what made Daniel's attention sharpen further. Because trained dogs reacted to command, to motion, to threat cues that aligned with learned patterns, yet Frost was doing none of that. He was holding a line between observation and certainty that no one else had been taught to see. 10 minutes passed without disruption, without change, without a single deviation in Frost's focus, and that was when Daniel realized the stillness itself had become the signal. He stepped a little closer, not enough to interfere, just enough to observe the angle of Frost's body relative to Evan Cole, the alignment too precise to be accidental, like a guard not waiting for instruction but for confirmation. The stranger adjusted his jacket, glanced toward the administrative building, then toward the perimeter gate, mapping something internally without speaking it aloud, and Frost responded with a subtle shift in weight, as if tracking a thought rather than a movement. Daniel's radio crackled with routine updates, but he lowered his hand slightly, letting the noise fade into background, because something about the moment felt suspended, like the calm before a decision that had not yet declared itself. Frost's gaze did not waver, and in that sustained attention there was no confusion, no hesitation, only a quiet certainty that the man in front of him was not simply passing through the wrong place, but carrying something that did not belong there. And still, nothing had happened yet, nothing that could be pointed to, nothing that could be recorded, only a dog standing still under a gray Virginia sky, watching a stranger as if time itself had narrowed down to a single unanswered question. Daniel Hayes did not look away, even when the rest of the morning began to pretend everything was normal again, because experience had taught him that the most dangerous moments rarely announced themselves. They simply existed until someone was brave enough or foolish enough to notice them. Frost remained in the same position near the edge of the logistics yard, his white coat reflecting the weak sunlight that filtered through the thin clouds above Fort Belvoir, while Evan Cole continued moving through the space with a calm that felt rehearsed rather than natural. A supervisor approached the contractor, exchanging brief instructions about delivery routes and documentation checks. But Frost's attention never followed the conversation. It stayed fixed on the man himself, as if sound and speech were irrelevant layers of information that did not matter compared to something deeper beneath them. Daniel stepped closer to the shaded side of a storage structure, keeping enough distance to avoid interference, but close enough to read the environment, his eyes tracking the subtle rhythm between the dog and the stranger. Frost's breathing was steady, controlled, not aggressive, but intensely focused, the kind of focus that usually preceded detection training responses. Except there was no obvious trigger, no scent alert, no motion that would normally justify such fixation. Evan Cole checked his wristwatch, then adjusted the strap of his identification badge, movements smooth and unhurried. Yet something about the timing of those gestures felt slightly out of sync with the environment, as if he was aware of being observed but unsure how closely. Frost took another step forward, then paused again, narrowing the distance between himself and the stranger just enough to redefine the space as shared rather than separate, and Daniel noticed how the surrounding personnel still did not react, continuing their tasks without interruption, unaware that the atmosphere had shifted into something quieter and more precise. The wind moved lightly across the base, carrying the faint scent of diesel and metal from nearby vehicles, and in that same wind Frost's ears adjusted minutely, responding not to noise but to presence, recalibrating with every small change in Evan Cole's posture. The contractor began walking toward the administrative checkpoint, likely following his assigned route, and Frost mirrored the movement without command, maintaining a parallel line that made it clear this was no coincidence of position but deliberate tracking behavior. Daniel's attention sharpened further as he observed the way Frost never allowed the stranger to move outside his field of awareness, always keeping him centered, always correcting for distance and angle, like a system built for continuous surveillance rather than passive observation. A passing officer greeted Evan Cole casually, asking for verification of his delivery manifest, and the stranger responded with polite efficiency, producing documents that appeared standard and complete. Yet Frost reacted to the interaction with a subtle change in posture, a tightening through his shoulders that suggested recognition of something invisible to everyone else. Daniel felt the weight of uncertainty build in his thoughts, because everything visible confirmed normalcy, yet everything behavioral suggested deviation, and in military environments those two realities were never supposed to exist at the same time without reason. Frost stopped again, planting himself between two marked zones of the yard, a position that created a natural barrier in the path ahead, forcing Evan Cole to alter his trajectory slightly without acknowledging why he did so. The stranger complied without hesitation, stepping around the dog's position, but in that adjustment there was a brief moment where his eyes met Frost's, and the exchange lasted just long enough to feel like recognition rather than coincidence. Daniel saw it clearly, though he could not define it, a fraction of silence between them that carried more weight than the entire conversation around them. Frost did not move after that moment. He simply held his position, as if waiting for something internal to confirm what external evidence had not yet revealed. The base continued functioning around them, indifferent to the tension forming in one small pocket of its daily routine, and yet Daniel Hayes knew from years of service that systems often failed not in loud disruptions, but in quiet alignments no one questioned soon enough. Frost's gaze remained locked forward, unwavering, unblinking, as Evan Cole continued toward the next checkpoint, and the distance between observation and action began to shrink in a way that no one except the dog seemed fully prepared to understand. The moment Evan Cole reached the second checkpoint, the entire atmosphere of the logistics corridor shifted in a way that was subtle enough to escape most eyes, but not the eyes of Staff Sergeant Daniel Hayes, who had learned over years of service that changes in human behavior rarely came from what people said, but from how they moved when they thought no one was watching. Frost remained at a controlled distance behind, maintaining a precise alignment with the contractor's trajectory, his white coat contrasting sharply against the muted greens and grays of Fort Belvoir's infrastructure. The sun had climbed higher now, but it did little to warm the cold tension building beneath the surface of routine operations. Evan Cole presented his documentation at the checkpoint officer's desk, speaking in a calm, professional tone about delivery verification schedules, while Frost stood just beyond the boundary of the marked walkway, his posture unchanged yet unmistakably more focused than before. Daniel observed carefully from a lateral position near a parked utility vehicle, his eyes tracking micro details that most would overlook, like the way Evan Cole adjusted his stance every time Frost repositioned himself, as if unconsciously recalibrating his own distance from the animal's awareness. Around them, personnel continued their duties, unaware that something unspoken had begun to thread itself through the environment, connecting dog, handler, and stranger in a triangle of silent evaluation. Frost's behavior was not escalating in the traditional sense. There was no barking, no agitation, no visible distress, but there was an unbroken continuity in his attention that felt heavier than any physical reaction. Every movement Evan Cole made was absorbed and measured by the dog, processed without hesitation, as though the dog was comparing present behavior against a memory that no one else had access to. Daniel stepped closer to the edge of the corridor, watching as the contractor finished the checkpoint verification and began to walk toward the vehicle staging area. Frost followed immediately, not rushing, not lagging, maintaining a steady distance that mirrored surveillance rather than companionship. The base's ambient noise filled the background, engines idling, radios exchanging updates, metal doors opening and closing, yet within that noise there was a narrow silence that seemed to follow Frost wherever he moved. Evan Cole paused briefly near a stack of sealed containers, glancing around, as if confirming orientation, and in that moment Frost stopped as well, locking his position directly across from him. The stillness between them felt structured, almost deliberate, as though an invisible line had been drawn in the space that neither side could cross without consequence. Daniel noticed the slight tightening in Frost's shoulders, a subtle change in posture that suggested heightened evaluation rather than aggression, and that distinction mattered, because trained detection dogs did not act without reason, even when humans could not yet identify the source. Evan Cole resumed walking, this time slightly faster, his route shifting toward a less populated section of the yard, and Frost adjusted instantly, maintaining perfect correspondence with the change. The pattern repeated itself twice more. Each time the contractor altered direction, Frost mirrored with immediate precision, as though predicting movement before it fully occurred. Daniel felt a quiet unease forming in his thoughts, not because anything had broken protocol, but because everything was operating just within the limits of what protocol could explain. The gap between normal and abnormal was narrowing into something too thin to ignore. Frost's gaze never left Evan Cole, and within that unwavering focus there was a sense of accumulation, like the dog was building a case out of fragments no one else could perceive. The contractor finally stopped near the outer staging area, turning slightly as if preparing to conclude his delivery task, and for the first time Frost moved into a position that placed him directly in line with the man's forward path. It was not aggressive, not defensive, but absolute in its placement, a silent interruption that forced awareness without force. Daniel Hayes stepped forward a little more decisively now, his attention fully engaged, because whatever was unfolding was no longer just observation. It was alignment, and alignment in military environments always meant something was about to be understood that had been overlooked for too long. The moment Frost positioned himself directly in the path of Evan Cole, the entire staging area seemed to compress into a smaller, more concentrated space, as if the boundaries of routine operations had narrowed around a single unresolved question, and Staff Sergeant Daniel Hayes finally stepped forward with the calm authority of someone who understood that moments like this were never about urgency alone, but about clarity under pressure. Evan Cole stopped as well, not abruptly, but with a controlled pause that suggested awareness without admission, his posture remaining composed while his eyes briefly scanned the dog standing between him and the continuation of his assigned route. Frost did not growl, did not lunge, did not display aggression, instead maintaining a steady, unwavering presence that felt more like verification than confrontation, and Daniel immediately recognized that distinction because trained K-9 units did not act without internal certainty, even when humans lacked external confirmation. The ambient sounds of Fort Belvoir continued around them, trucks reversing in distant lanes, radios exchanging routine status updates, footsteps of personnel moving between assignments. Yet within this small convergence point, everything felt slowed, as though time itself was adjusting to accommodate observation. Daniel raised a hand slightly, signaling for the checkpoint officer to remain in position, then shifted his focus fully onto Evan Cole, whose expression remained neutral but now carried a faint tension beneath the surface, visible only in the subtle tightening of his jaw and the careful stillness of his hands. Frost maintained eye contact with the contractor, unbroken and deliberate, and in that sustained attention Daniel began to notice patterns that had been invisible before, including the way Evan Cole consistently avoided placing his full weight on certain movements, as if minimizing noise not in sound but in attention. The contractor's identification badge was still visible, his documentation still valid in the system, yet Frost's reaction suggested a discrepancy that paperwork alone could not resolve. Daniel took another step forward, closing the distance enough to speak clearly without raising his voice, asking Evan Cole to remain stationary for a brief verification review, and the contractor complied without protest, which in itself was neither suspicious nor reassuring, only consistent with someone who understood procedure. Frost circled slowly, not breaking line of sight, but adjusting position to maintain a constant angle of observation, and Daniel noticed how the dog occasionally paused at specific points around the contractor's belongings, focusing briefly on the carry bag resting near his leg. That detail shifted Daniel's attention, because while human suspicion often followed behavior, canine detection often followed proximity to objects rather than actions, and Frost's interest appeared unusually concentrated on that single item. The checkpoint officer requested a secondary verification scan, and Evan Cole nodded, stepping slightly aside to allow access to his bag, but Frost immediately repositioned himself again, closing the gap before anyone else could approach it. There was no aggression in the movement, only prevention, as if the dog was enforcing a boundary that had not yet been verbally acknowledged. Daniel gestured for the bag to be placed on a nearby inspection table, and Evan Cole complied, placing it down with controlled precision that still revealed nothing. Outwardly irregular, Frost remained fixed on it, unmoving now, his entire posture aligned with the object rather than the man, and that shift in focus changed the nature of the moment from observation of person to evaluation of intent. A security technician approached with a scanning device, moving slowly and methodically, while Daniel maintained visual contact with both the contractor and the dog, aware that whatever was about to happen would not come from force, but from verification. As the scanner passed over the bag, Frost did not react outwardly, but his stillness deepened, becoming almost absolute, and Daniel felt the tension in the air shift again, not toward conflict, but toward revelation. The technician paused, adjusted the device, and scanned once more, then signaled for a more detailed inspection without speaking. And at that moment, Evan Cole's composure changed in a way that was barely perceptible, a fraction of hesitation that lasted less than a second, but carried disproportionate weight. Daniel stepped closer to the table, his voice calm but firm as he requested the bag be opened under supervision, and Evan Cole did not resist, only exhaled slowly before unfastening the straps. Frost remained motionless, watching every movement with unwavering attention, and as the bag opened under controlled procedure, the atmosphere shifted again, not into chaos, but into confirmation that something previously unseen had finally become visible. Daniel did not speak immediately, because experience had taught him that the most important moments were not defined by reaction, but by recognition, and in that recognition the role of the dog was no longer uncertain. It was essential, because Frost had not been reacting to threat. He had been identifying it long before anyone else had reached the point of understanding it. The moment the inspection reached full confirmation stage, the entire staging area at Fort Belvoir shifted from controlled uncertainty into a state of focused clarity, where every movement carried weight and every silence felt intentional, and Staff Sergeant Daniel Hayes stood just behind the inspection table, watching as the security technician carefully documented the contents that had just been revealed. Frost remained completely still, positioned slightly forward of Daniel and angled toward Evan Cole, but his attention no longer needed to move, because what he had already identified had now been acknowledged by procedure. Evan Cole stood on the opposite side of the table, his posture unchanged in appearance. Yet the subtle tension in his shoulders had become more visible, not through dramatic movement, but through the absence of ease that had previously defined his behavior. The checkpoint officer reviewed the scanning results on a handheld device, then exchanged a brief look with the technician, a silent confirmation that required no verbal explanation, and that moment alone was enough to shift the tone of the entire area. Daniel did not speak immediately, because experience had taught him that conclusions should never be rushed ahead of process, but his attention remained fixed on Frost, who had finally relaxed his stance by a fraction, not in relief, but in completion, as though the task he had been performing internally had reached its final point. The bag remained open on the table under controlled supervision, its contents now cataloged and secured for further evaluation, while Evan Cole was asked to remain in place until the verification process was fully concluded. The contractor complied without resistance, his expression still composed, yet now carrying a quieter stillness that suggested awareness of shifting outcomes rather than confusion. Around them, the base continued its normal operational rhythm, but within this small perimeter the atmosphere had fundamentally changed, no longer defined by uncertainty, but by recognition that something previously hidden had been brought into the light through procedural confirmation. Daniel stepped slightly closer to Frost, lowering his voice as if speaking to both the dog and the moment itself, acknowledging that the behavior observed had aligned precisely with detection protocol beyond what standard screening had initially flagged. Frost did not respond with movement, but his ears adjusted subtly, tracking Daniel's presence while maintaining focus. On the resolve point of interest, Evan Cole was escorted a short distance away from the inspection table under standard containment procedure, not with force, but with controlled professionalism that reflected protocol rather than escalation, and he did not resist or attempt to flee, only complying with measured steps as he was guided to a secondary observation area. Daniel followed at a distance, observing every detail, noting how Frost did not pursue the movement, but instead remained near the inspection table, as if confirming that his role was complete once verification had been achieved. The security technician began final documentation, marking timestamps, recording chain of custody, and logging the detection event into the system, while the checkpoint officer coordinated with Base Security Command for further review. Daniel's attention briefly shifted to the surrounding personnel, many of whom were only now beginning to understand that the earlier stillness of the dog had not been random behavior, but structured detection response that preceded human confirmation. Frost finally moved after several seconds of stillness, walking calmly toward Daniel's side rather than toward the escorted contractor, and stopping there with a quiet presence that felt less like action and more like closure. Daniel looked down at him, then back toward the secured inspection area, recognizing that what had unfolded was not a moment of chaos, but a demonstration of precision that had prevented uncertainty from becoming risk. The wind moved lightly across the staging yard again, carrying the ordinary sounds of a military morning, but now those sounds felt different, as if the environment itself had recalibrated around what had just been understood. Frost remained beside Daniel, steady and silent, no longer tracking movement, because the question that had held his attention from the beginning had finally been answered in the only way that mattered within the structure of their world, through confirmation rather than assumption, through process rather than speculation. The confirmation report had already been filed, the inspection area had returned to its operational rhythm, and yet Staff Sergeant Daniel Hayes remained in place near the staging corridor as if waiting for the last invisible piece of the situation to settle into understanding. Frost stood beside him, calm and motionless, his white coat reflecting the softened light of late morning, no longer tracking movement, no longer evaluating distance, simply present in a state of completion that only followed resolution. Across the yard, Evan Cole was held in a standard administrative holding position, not restrained in any aggressive sense, but contained within procedural protocol, while further verification continued through communication channels and database cross-checks. The atmosphere at Fort Belvoir had shifted again, not into tension, but into the quiet aftermath that follows when uncertainty is replaced by documented certainty, and everyone involved begins to process what had just occurred in real time. Daniel finally exhaled in a controlled way, shifting his weight slightly as he reviewed the sequence of events internally, not as isolated moments, but as a continuous pattern that had begun with a 10-minute observation and ended in procedural confirmation. Frost did not move, but his ears adjusted once in response to Daniel's presence, acknowledging him without breaking the calm state he had entered. A base security supervisor approached Daniel with a tablet, providing a brief verbal update that additional review units had been notified and that the contractor's access permissions were now temporarily suspended pending full evaluation. Daniel nodded once, his attention still partially anchored to Frost, because what stood out most was not the detection itself, but the precision with which it had unfolded without deviation or hesitation. The supervisor continued past him toward the administrative building, leaving Daniel alone again in a small pocket of silence within the broader operational environment. Frost shifted his stance slightly, repositioning himself so that he now stood parallel with Daniel rather than oriented toward any external subject. And in that subtle change there was a clear signal that his active evaluation cycle had ended. Daniel placed a hand briefly on the dog's shoulder, a gesture that carried no command, only acknowledgement, and Frost accepted it without reaction, remaining steady as the wind moved lightly through the corridor between buildings. In the distance, vehicles continued to move through assigned lanes. Personnel continued scheduled tasks, and communication systems continued to relay routine updates, but none of it carried the same weight it had earlier, because the center of attention had already moved into resolution. Daniel looked toward the inspection table one final time, where the secured items had already been transferred for cataloging, and he reflected on how quickly perception could shift when instinct and procedure aligned at the same point of understanding. Frost remained beside him, no longer scanning, no longer analyzing, simply existing in the calm after action, as though the purpose of the morning had already been fulfilled in full. A few minutes passed without interruption, and during that time Daniel observed how the base returned fully to normal flow, as if nothing had disrupted it at all except for those who had been directly involved in the moment. The escort team moved Evan Cole toward a secondary evaluation area located beyond the main staging yard, following standard administrative protocol, while maintaining a controlled and professional pace that reflected procedure rather than urgency. Daniel did not follow, because his role had already transitioned into review observation, and more importantly because Frost remained where he was, signaling that there was nothing left requiring immediate response. The dog's breathing was slow and even, his posture relaxed but alert in a way that no longer indicated detection, only readiness without focus. Daniel stared at him for a moment longer, understanding more clearly than before that what he had witnessed was not randomness, not instinct alone, but a structured awareness operating beneath human visibility, responding not to what was spoken, but to what was intended. The morning sun continued to rise over Fort Belvoir, casting long steady light across the logistics yard, and in that light, everything looked unchanged again, except for the understanding carried quietly by the man and the dog standing together in silence after the system had already confirmed what instinct had known from the beginning. The late morning at Fort Belvoir had fully transitioned into its steady operational rhythm, but for Staff Sergeant Daniel Hayes, the experience of what had just occurred still lingered in the form of quiet reflection rather than urgency, as he stood near the edge of the logistics corridor with Frost now resting calmly at his side. The white German shepherd no longer displayed any of the earlier intensity, his posture relaxed yet attentive in the way trained military K-9 units remain even in moments of rest, as if the world itself is something to be continuously understood rather than ignored. Across the base, Evan Cole's presence had been fully transitioned into administrative processing, his movement no longer visible in the staging yard, only the procedural aftereffects of his verification review remaining in motion through communication channels and command updates. Daniel adjusted his stance slightly, shifting his gaze between the open yard and the distant administrative building, processing not the event itself anymore, but the implications of how quickly perception, instinct, and protocol had aligned into a single outcome. Frost remained still, occasionally turning his head just enough to acknowledge environmental changes, but never returning to the focused intensity that had defined his earlier behavior, as though the resolution of the situation had closed a mental loop within him that required no further input. A light wind moved through the corridor, carrying with it the distant sound of machinery and structured movement, the kind of soundscape that defined large-scale military installations where routine was the foundation of order. Daniel placed both hands briefly on his belt, his eyes narrowing slightly as he reviewed the sequence again internally, not as isolated actions, but as a continuous flow that began with silence, built through observation, and concluded with confirmation that required no interpretation beyond what had already been recorded. A nearby officer passed by, offering a brief update that additional internal review teams were now examining the contractor's access history and logistical route data, and Daniel acknowledged the information with a small nod without breaking focus from Frost. The dog shifted his weight once, settling more comfortably into a resting position beside Daniel, his white coat catching the light in a way that made him stand out against the muted industrial environment of the base. There was no remaining tension in his posture, only stability, the kind that follows completion rather than anticipation, and Daniel found himself studying that change more than anything else, because it marked the transition from active detection to full disengagement. The staging yard beyond them continued its normal cycle, vehicles moving in and out of designated lanes, personnel communicating through standard channels, yet none of it carried the same heightened awareness that had defined the earlier moment, as though the system itself had absorbed the anomaly and returned to baseline operation. Daniel exhaled slowly, turning his attention briefly toward the inspection area where the verification process had originated, now cleared and reset for normal use, the physical evidence of the event already redistributed into procedural channels. Frost followed his gaze but did not react further, simply observing without focus, as if acknowledging that the environment no longer required interpretation. Daniel stepped forward a few feet, then stopped again, his mind returning to the precision of Frost's behavior, especially the way every adjustment had been timed not by instruction, but by internal certainty that preceded human confirmation. That realization settled deeper in his thoughts now that the immediate tension had passed, because it suggested a layer of operational awareness that functioned independently of verbal command or visual cue, relying instead on something far more subtle and immediate. Frost remained at his side, steady and silent, no longer engaged in evaluation, and Daniel finally placed a hand once more on the dog's shoulder, this time holding it a moment longer as acknowledgement of what had been witnessed and what had been quietly confirmed through action rather than assumption. The wind continued across the base, carrying the ordinary sounds of a facility returning fully to its scheduled structure, but within Daniel's awareness there remained a clear understanding that the morning had not been ordinary in the way it began, only in the way it had resolved. The afternoon sun over Fort Belvoir had shifted slightly westward, casting longer shadows across the logistics yard as the base settled fully back into its routine operations, and Staff Sergeant Daniel Hayes stood near the same corridor where the morning's events had unfolded, now observing not with urgency, but with a measured calm that came only after a situation had been fully resolved and processed through every layer of procedure and understanding. Frost remained beside him, still and composed, his white coat illuminated in soft contrast against the muted tones of concrete, steel, and movement that defined the installation, no longer scanning or evaluating, but simply existing in a state of quiet readiness that required no further instruction. The administrative channels had already completed their initial reporting cycle, and Evan Cole's case had moved into extended review status under multiple oversight units, leaving only the residual awareness of what had taken place earlier that day. Daniel adjusted his posture slightly, exhaling as he let his focus drift across the yard, noting how quickly the environment had normalized, as if the intensity of the earlier hours had been absorbed seamlessly into the structure of routine military function. Frost shifted once, not in response to anything external, but in a subtle adjustment of comfort, his attention no longer anchored to a single point, and that change alone marked the full closure of his detection cycle. Daniel glanced down at him for a moment, then back toward the open space ahead, his thoughts no longer on what had happened step by step, but on what it revealed about the nature of trained perception operating beyond human awareness. A light breeze passed through the corridor, carrying the distant sound of vehicles and procedural communication, and Daniel found himself reflecting on how invisible the most important moments often were to those not directly positioned to observe them. The checkpoint area had been reset, equipment returned to standard configuration, inspection tables cleared, and personnel redistributed to their assigned tasks. Yet for Daniel, the memory of Frost's unwavering focus remained sharper than anything else, not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise in a way that left no room for interpretation once understood. Frost remained at ease, his posture neutral, his breathing steady, occasionally turning his head slightly as environmental sounds changed, but never returning to the fixed intensity that had defined the earlier engagement. Daniel placed one hand briefly on the dog's back again, not as command or reinforcement, but as acknowledgement of presence and shared understanding, and Frost accepted it without reaction, maintaining his calm state as if confirming that the interaction required no further response. Across the yard, personnel continued moving between assignments, the steady rhythm of military logistics uninterrupted by what had occurred earlier, and that contrast between external normalcy and internal recognition created a quiet distance in Daniel's awareness. He stepped forward a few feet, then paused, allowing himself a final moment of reflection as he considered how every phase of the morning had aligned into a single coherent outcome, beginning with observation, passing through evaluation, and ending in procedural certainty. Frost stood beside him, no longer oriented toward any target or subject, simply aligned with Daniel's position as if that was the only reference point that mattered now. The wind moved gently through the open structures of the base, and Daniel finally allowed his thoughts to settle completely, understanding that the event was no longer an active concern, but a completed sequence that had demonstrated the full integration of instinct, training, and verification within a single uninterrupted chain of action, leaving only quiet resolution in its wake. By the time the sun had begun to lower over Fort Belvoir, casting a warmer but softer light across the logistics yard, the entire installation had fully returned to its structured rhythm, and yet for Staff Sergeant Daniel Hayes, the memory of the morning remained present not as disruption, but as a completed lesson in how precision, instinct, and verification could align without conflict when every element functioned as intended. Frost stood beside him near the corridor where they had spent most of the afternoon, his white coat now blending gently with the fading brightness of the day, his posture relaxed in a way that signaled complete disengagement from operational focus, as though the world no longer required evaluation. The administrative follow-up on Evan Cole had already moved into deeper review channels within military security oversight, leaving only procedural echoes in communication logs and confirmation reports, while the physical environment itself appeared entirely unchanged from any ordinary afternoon. Daniel exhaled slowly, shifting his stance as he looked across the base, observing how personnel moved with standard efficiency, unaware in their daily tasks of the precise sequence that had unfolded earlier in the day. Frost adjusted slightly, stepping closer to Daniel's side without command, not as a response to threat, but as a natural alignment that reflected the end of operational necessity. There was no tension left in his body, no scanning behavior, no analytical stillness, only the quiet presence of a trained unit that had completed its task and returned to baseline awareness. Daniel placed one hand gently on the dog's back, holding it there for a few seconds longer than before, not as reinforcement or instruction, but as recognition of what had been achieved through observation and response without error or hesitation. The wind moved lightly through the open structures of the base, carrying distant mechanical sounds and routine communication across the yard, and in that ordinary soundscape Daniel felt the contrast more clearly than ever, how something so structured and controlled could still contain moments of absolute clarity that existed only briefly before dissolving back into normalcy. Frost remained steady, his breathing calm, and even, occasionally shifting his head toward ambient movement, but never focusing again on any single point, as if confirming that no further interpretation was required. Daniel's attention drifted once more to the inspection corridor in the distance, now cleared and restored, the location of earlier verification no longer marked by anything other than memory and documentation. He thought about how the entire sequence had begun with nothing more than a silent observation and ended with full procedural confirmation, without escalation, without uncertainty persisting beyond its necessary boundary. Frost leaned slightly into Daniel's side, a subtle gesture of comfort rather than command, and Daniel accepted it without thought, allowing the moment to settle fully into his understanding. Around them, the base continued its steady rhythm, vehicles moving in assigned lanes, personnel completing scheduled tasks, communication systems maintaining constant flow. Yet within Daniel's awareness, there was a quiet separation between what the world saw and what had actually been understood earlier that day. He remained still for a moment longer, then slowly straightened, looking out across Fort Belvoir as the light continued to soften toward evening. Frost stayed at his side, no longer an instrument of detection, no longer an observer of anomaly, but simply present, as the final quiet confirmation that some truths are not revealed through reaction, but through the steady alignment of instinct and certainty that only becomes visible once everything else has already returned to normal.